So, welcome everybody to this, the first in this year's series of lectures supported by the John Templeton Foundation. I'm told that my very first duty is to introduce myself. So, for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Martin Taylor, and I'm the Physical Secretary and Vice President of the Royal Society. Now, as I've already indicated, you're all very welcome, and in order to be possibly just a little bit more welcome, could I ask you all to switch off your mobile phones, pages and whatever, so that we could avoid what we might term unfortunate interruptions. So this, the very warmest of welcomes, comes from the Royal Society and includes not only those of you gathered here in the lecture theatre, but also the many who are viewing proceedings over the web. And very especially, this includes members of the John Templeton Foundation who will be watching from the United States of America. This, as I've just said before, is the first in this year's series of lectures on the nature of human knowledge and understanding, which is generously supported by the John Templeton Foundation. The mission of these lectures is to serve as a catalyst for scientific discovery on what scientists and philosophers call the big questions, with the intention being that they should range from questions about the laws of nature to the nature of creativity and consciousness. We are delighted to have John Polkinghorne here with us today as our first lecturer this year. John is one of the greatest living writers and thinkers on science and religion. He is a truly world-class scientist turned priest and is currently just one of 2 Reverend Fellows here in the Royal Society. So if there's 2 of them, the other one I should perhaps tell you is my old friend and the statistician Bernard Silverman. John is just one of only 3 Reverend Knights of the British Empire. For 25 years, John was a theoretical physicist working on theories of elementary particles, and for 11 of these years he was a professor of mathematical physics at the University of Cambridge, and he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1974. He later resigned his professorial chair to study for the Church of England ministry, and was ordained an Anglican priest in 1982. It was at this time, when we were both Fellows of Trinity College, that I got to know John, and I vividly remember his enthusiasm for the parochial ministry. As I recall, he wanted to work with the poor in Bristol. Actually, after what seemed to me at least a short while, he returned to Cambridge to be Dean of Chapel at Trinity Hall, which seemed to prove that you can't keep a good man down, really. He came bouncing back. He then later became president of Queen's College, Cambridge, a position from which he retired in 1996. In 2002, he was awarded the Templeton Prize for his contributions to research at the interface between science and religion. John has been a member of the BMA Medical Ethics Committee, the General Synod of the Church of England, the Doctrine Commission, and the Human Genetics Commission. He is currently Canon Theologian of Liverpool, and John is a founding member of the Society of Ordained Scientists, and also of the International Society for Science and Religion, of which he was the first president. John has written many books concerning science and religion, and these include Quarks, Chaos and Christianity, The Faith of a Physicist, and also Belief in God in an Age of Science. In short, ladies and gentlemen, John is an extremely distinguished theoretical physicist, and at the same time, one of the most eminent thinkers concerning the interface between science and religion. It is therefore my very great pleasure to present the Reverend Dr. John Polkinghorne, who will now speak to us on exchanges in science and religion.
I hope you'll excuse me if I sit down to give my lecture. I'm suffering from back problems that make it painful for me to stand for any length of time. What I lose in authority by sitting down, I shall gain in comfort. Let me begin with a statement that I venture to believe will receive widespread agreement. Research in science is hard work. As in all forms of worthwhile activity, there is a fair share of somewhat wearisome routine to be endured. There is also inevitable frustration, as the good ideas of the morning often prove less persuasive in the cold light of the afternoon. So why do we do it? The simple answer is the desire to understand the world, to comprehend the structure and process of the universe, and to unravel the details of its long and fruitful history. That is a high endeavor of manifest seriousness and value. And science has been astonishingly successful in its chosen task. And those who labor in it, whether as one of the geniuses who open up new patterns of understanding, or simply, as is the case, of course, for most of us, as part of the army of honest toilers, they are rewarded from time to time by the gift of wonder at the beautiful order revealed through scientific discovery. I do not suppose that the word wonder appears frequently in the pages of the philosophical transactions or proceedings, but it is not uncommon in the informal conversation of scientists as they try to speak of their experiences in the research community. And this is a point to which I shall return. Yet, those who are truly imbued with the thirst for understanding will not find that it is quenched by science alone. The truth of the matter is that science has purchased its very great success by the modesty of its actual ambition. It limits its inquiry to a certain kind of encounter with reality, one that is essentially objective in its character. Science treats the world as an it, you might say. This limitation affords science its great secret weapon, which is the appeal to experiment, in principle, repeatable at will. If you do not believe someone else's claim, then go and look into the matter for yourself. I was a theoretical physicist, very much, I have to say, a pencil and paper sort of chap, but I would gladly acknowledge that elementary particle physics, during my time in it, which was essentially the 25-year exploration that led to the standard model of quark theory, the subject at that time was experimentally driven. Even the greatest theorists were from time to time surprised and provoked to new ideas by the discoveries of their experimental colleagues. The questions that science addresses are also limited. Its essential concern is with the process of the world, asking the question how, one might say. But there are other questions, such as why, for example, which are also meaningful and necessary to ask, and which science simply brackets out of its investigation. This narrow focus of scientific concern has been a methodological strategy of great power. Yet it would be a great mistake to confuse this focus technique with metaphysical adequacy. Now, I know, of course, that metaphysical is not a word that is popular in the scientific community. In fact, it shares with theological the fate of often being unthinkingly used as a dismissive adjective. But in fact, no one lives without adopting a worldview, and that is just what metaphysics is about. We think metaphysically, as naturally and inevitably as we speak prose. Scientistic triumphalists who proclaim that science is the sum total of all real knowledge that we shall ever have or ever need have are making a metaphysical assertion quite as much as those of us who take a broader and deeper view of the scope of human knowledge and experience. These reductionists have not deduced their implausible claim from science itself, but they have imposed it upon science from without. And the fact of the matter, it seems to me, is that the richness of reality greatly exceeds the self-imposed confines of the scientific view. There is a great swathe of human experience that we may call personal, in which reality is encountered not as an it, but as a thou. And in this realm, there is an inescapable role for the unique. We do not have repeatability. We never hear a Mozart quartet exactly the same way twice, even if we replay the same disc. In personal relations, testing has to give way to trusting as the character of the encounter. If I am always setting little traps to see if you are my friend, I shall soon destroy the possibility of friendship between us, which can only be based upon mutual trust. There is also a widely attested realm of experience in which human beings describe a transpersonal encounter with sacred reality. This experience may have the character of the unitive experiences of the mystics, or it may have the numinous character of a meeting with divine reality perceived as standing over against us in mercy and judgment. Both kinds of experience are part of the portfolio of religious encounter with the sacred. The world in which we live is very rich and many-layered, and science only encounters it at one level. Its methodological strategy of bracking out questions of meaning, value, and purpose by no means implies that these questions are not necessary and meaningful to ask and to pursue, though that pursuit will have to employ methods of inquiry that are different from those of science. The essence of rationality is to strive to conform one's thinking to the actual nature of what one is trying to think about. There is no universal epistemology by means of which all entities can be known in the same way. Even within physics, this is clearly the case. The Newtonian world of classical physics can be known in its everyday clarity and reliability, but the quantum world can only be known according to its Heisenbergian uncertainty and fitful probability. Quantum thinking had to come to terms with a counterintuitive superposition principle that permits the combination of possibilities, such as electron being here and being there, which everyday thinking would judge to be immiscible. If the study of science teaches about anything, it surely is that reality is often found to be surprising, recalcitrant to the prior expectation with which we approach it. It therefore seems to me that the instinctive question for a scientist to ask is not, is it reasonable, as if we knew beforehand the shape that rationality had to take, but rather the scientist's instinctive question, I believe, is, what makes you think that might be the case? See, that's a question open about the character of its answer, but rightly insisting on evidential motivation for what is asserted by way of reply. Our personal experiences of human relationship, beauty, and ethical imperative are to be taken with the utmost seriousness, but they cannot be evaluated and understood if one attempts to force them into being treated according to the impersonal protocols of scientific investigation. Reality is not a lunar landscape populated by information-processing, self-replicating systems. Its inhabitants are persons. There is a broad spectrum of human rational inquiry into reality, ranging from science at one end to theology at the other. And the components of that great spectrum differ according to the degree to which we possess control over the initiation of our encounter with that reality. We transcend the physical world, and science can put it to the test as it wills. God transcends us. We depend upon divine acts of self-disclosure as the basis for theological understanding. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. It's just a fact of the spiritual life. There are records of religious experience which provide material for theological discourse, motivations for theological ideas. And I shall return to this point later when I say something about revelation. But to try to induce divine disclosure or to manipulate divine power is to commit the sinful error of attempting magic. All these many forms of human investigation along the spectrum of rational inquiry are concerned with seeking understanding through the search for motivated belief, all of them. Together, they constitute our encounter with the reality within which we live. The difference is the kind of motivation that is relevant to that particular part of the spectrum of reality. All forms of rational exploration also share in the fact that their pursuit requires a degree of intellectual boldness, of daring. This is because none of them has access to the logical certainty of proof. The many 20th century analyses of the philosophy of science have made it abundantly clear that there is an inescapable degree of circularity involved in the scientific interaction between theory and experiment. The interpretation of experiment needs the adoption of a theoretical point of view. Theories are confirmed or disconfirmed by experiment. There is no escape from this hermeneutic circle. And this produces a certain degree of rational precariousness. I am sure that the impressive long-term fruitfulness of scientific ideas strongly encourages the belief that this circularity is benign and not vicious. But its presence means that the ambition to write about the logic of scientific discovery, which of course is what Karl Popper sought to do, the logic of scientific discovery is in fact a misconceived goal. In fact, it seems to me that strict proof is not a very useful concept, since there seems to be a kind of complementary duality between what can be proved beyond a peradventure and what is actually interesting. Even in mathematics, Kurt Gödel has shown us that axiomatized systems are either inconsistent, or if they're consistent, they are incomplete. They contain statements that can be uttered and which are true but cannot be proved within that system. The philosopher of science who has most influenced me has been Michael Polanyi. He had been a distinguished physical chemist before he took to philosophy. And so I think alone of the great figures in the philosophy of science in the 20th century, he knew science from the inside. And you can recognize that in his writings, it seems to me. His most important book, which is Personal Knowledge, emphasizes that the practice of science calls for tacit skills of judgment that cannot be reduced to a protocol implementable upon a computer. Rather, they have to be learned through apprenticeship to a truth-seeking community, and then they have to be exercised by persons. It's a recurrent theme in Polanyi that we know more than we can tell. We have tacit skills that we have to acquire in that sort of way. In the preface to Personal Knowledge, Polanyi says he is writing his book about science to explain how he can commit himself to what he believes to be true while knowing that it might be false. I think that's the epistemological status of humanity. Commitment to well-winnowed belief is rationally justifiable, but it is not logically certain. I suppose I don't need to argue that religious belief also comes under this Polanyian rubric. One sometimes hears religion being compared unfavorably with science in terms of asserting that the latter, science, deals with public fact, while the former, religion, only deals with private opinion. I think that statement makes a double mistake. All scientific facts that are interesting are already interpreted facts. They are not naked facts in some unproblematic sense, reflecting the inextricable entanglement of experiment and theory. And, I believe, religious beliefs are motivated beliefs. This last point needs some emphasis. Scientists know that religious belief involves faith, and say sometimes picture this as being a matter of shutting one's eyes, gritting one's teeth, believing 6 impossible things before breakfast because some unquestionable authority tells you that is what you have to do. That is not at all what faith's about. If religious belief actually involved intellectual suicide in this way, I could not be a religious person. There is a leap of faith, but it is a leap into the light and not into the dark. Fortunately, faith is not like that. I have motivations for my religious beliefs, just as I have motivations for my scientific beliefs. Of course, the kinds of motivation differ in the two cases because the subject matter of the two discourses differs in the ways that we have been considering. In theology, revelation does not mean the conveyance of incredible propositions endorsed by mysteriously ineffable means, but it is the record of those people and events through which the divine nature has been most clearly disclosed. In the Christian case, we look to the history of Israel, of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Understood in this way, Scripture is not a handy textbook of divinely guaranteed answers to the exam questions of life, but it is a kind of laboratory notebook of the Spirit, affording evidential support for theological ideas. Religious understanding is corrigible and has been in need of correction from time to time, in much the same way, I think, as science has been necessarily corrected from time to time, even if the timescale for change in theology is typically longer than in science. The Bible records part of this unfolding process of understanding, the kind of unedifying incidents and inadequate pictures of the divine will that one finds, for example, in the books of Joshua and Judges, correspond to a primitive state of theological understanding, just as the ideas of caloric and phlogiston corresponded to a primitive state in the development of science. I believe that theology trades in motivated belief, but I recognize, of course, that not all will accept the adequacy of the motivation offered. But at the very least, they should be willing to acknowledge its existence and to give it an appropriate degree of consideration. Some scientists are apparently willing to make high-profile assertions about the irrationality of religious belief without ever giving theology proper attention at all. And it seems to me that their writings in this matter have a similar status to the communications of scientifically illiterate people who send one unsolicited papers with titles like "Einstein was wrong." I really do believe that. The issues are too significant for trivialized discussion of that kind. It is disingenuous to choose fundamentalists as sole representatives of religious believers. It is ignorant not to recognize that people like Augustine, Aquinas, and many other theological figures were people of high intelligence and passionate commitment to the search for truth, whose writings are worthy of respectful engagement. While it is certainly true that and sadly true, that religious believers have done terrible things and said foolish things, it is a mere polemical debating trick to ignore the fact that the same has also been true, alas, of non-believers. My thesis, therefore, is that science and theology are rational cousins under the skin. Each, of course, has its distinctive character and its own proper domain of inquiry. But they are both part of the great human quest for understanding. And if that quest is to be fulfilled, we need the insights that both have to offer. We have every reason to expect that scientifically posable questions will receive, in due course, scientifically statable answers. But equally, theologically posable questions must receive theologically statable answers, which have to be supported by theological arguments, which may be theistic or atheistic, but they are theological in their character. There is no direct transfer from one discipline to the other in either direction, something that those who make scientific claims to have disposed of the delusion of God are refusing to recognize. Yet, though they have their separate spheres of investigation, both disciplines are concerned with dimensions of the one world of reality. And there must be a degree of consonance between the insights that each has to offer. To put the point a little crudely, but not, I think, misleadingly, how, which is really the scientific question, and why, which in a sense is the religious question, are both queries that can be put to the same phenomenon. But the answers that they receive must, of course, fit coherently together. It's one thing to say the kettle's boiling, A, because burning gas heats the water, and B, because I want to make a cup of tea. That fits in okay. But it would be something quite different to claim that my tea-making intention was being fulfilled by putting the kettle into the refrigerator. There has to be a consonance between the insights of science and religion, even if there is no entailment, but from one to the other. The concept of non-overlapping magisteria, the notion that science and religion operate in disjoint worlds between which there is no kind of interaction, that's an idea that's been embraced, of course, by Stephen Jay Gould, and also, I have to say, by scientific bodies not wanting to be culturally disrespectful to religion while not taking it too seriously either. And it just will not do. Because both science and religion trade in rationally motivated beliefs, they will have things to say to each other and gifts to give each other. And it is these intellectual exchanges that I must now turn. The great gift that science can give to theology is to tell it what the history of the universe, which theology regards as being a divine creation, what the history of the universe has actually been like and how its fabric is structured. Perhaps the most significant insight that science offers is the existence of deep time, a history of great extent in which the past has been very different from the present, together with the fact, of course, that it is evolutionary processes which have turned what was initially an almost uniform expanding ball of energy into the home of saints and scientists that we see today. We can certainly accept the slogan characterization of evolution as the interplay of chance and necessity, provided we understand that chance simply stands for the contingency of actual happenings, whose number, of course, falls very far short of what are all total possible conceivable events that might have occurred. That's what chance means. It means contingency, the contingency of happenstance. And it does not necessarily signify meaninglessness or the capricious acts of the goddess Fortuna. Similarly, necessity stands for the regularity of the world, but not for a relentless inevitability about all that happens. This evolutionary interplay between chance and necessity has been, of course, at work from the beginning, as much in the formation of stars and galaxies as in the familiar story of the development of terrestrial life. It is a fundamental scientific insight of very great significance that true novelty can only emerge in regimes that are, as we say, at the edge of chaos. Regimes where order and disorder, chance and necessity interlace each other. Too much on the orderly side of this frontier, and things are too rigid for anything to happen beyond mere rearrangements. Too much on the haphazard side, and any novelty that emerges will be unable to persist. It is that delicate balance between order and disorder that enables true novelty to come into being and to remain in being. Not only can theology welcome and take on board this scientific insight, but we can see that it actually helps theology as it tries to wrestle with one of its most intransigent problems. But before we get on to that, let's first of all get a little history straight. There is a popular but ignorant caricature that suggests that in 1859, when Charles Darwin published his great work on the origin of species, all the scientists cried, yes, 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 and all the religious people, and of course especially the obscurantist clergy, cried, no, no, no. In fact, there was a mixed response in both communities. Doubts and arguments continued among many scientists, and the dust did not fully settle until many years later with the recovery of the genetic insights of the Austrian monk Gregor Mendel and their further development, thereby, of course, clarifying the source and character of the small variations on which Darwin's theory depended. And response on the religious side was also from the start varied. Some religious people welcomed Darwinian insight from the very first. And the Anglican clergyman and novelist Charles Kingsley promptly coined a phrase that neatly encapsulates the theological way of thinking about evolution. What he said was this: no doubt God could have snapped the divine fingers, brought into being a ready-made world, but it turned out that God had done something cleverer than that in making a creation so endowed with potentiality that within it, creatures could make themselves. That's the theological slogan, if you like, to help us to think about an evolving world. It's a creation in which creatures are allowed to make themselves. In other words, the shuffling exploration of possibility through the particularities of happenstance, which is what evolutionary process is, that can be understood theologically as the gift of the Creator to creatures, a gift of a freedom to be themselves and to make themselves. And a very important theological concept underlies this understanding. Christian theology, which believes the fundamental character of the divine to be love, has to steer a course between two unacceptable extremes of a picture of God's relationship to creation. One is the picture of the God as a cosmic tyrant, the puppet master of the universe, pulling every string in acts of tight control. That's really couldn't be the God of love. The other, of course, the other extreme is the deistic spectator, who simply sets the universe going, and then indifferently watches it all happen. That couldn't be the God of love either. The Christian God must interact with creatures, but not in a way to take away their creaturely freedom. God interacts with the history of the universe, I believe, but God does not overrule the acts of creatures or the beings of creatures. In technical language, creation is a kenotic act, an act of divine self-limitation of power in permitting the creaturely other to be itself and to make itself. And the consequence of that is that all that happens will not necessarily be in accordance with God's positive intention. Putting it another way, the chance explorations of potentiality will not only bring great fruitfulness, but they also have ragged edges, and sometimes they will lead into blind alleys. A creation in which creatures make themselves is a great good, but it has an inescapable shadow side. Some genetic mutations will produce new forms of life. That's, of course, the engine that has driven the amazing 3.5 billion year history of life on Earth. But other mutations will induce malignancy. You cannot have one without the other, at least not in a non-magic world, and the universe is not magic because God is not a capricious magician. These insights help theology a little. I don't say more than that. They help theology a little with what is surely its most difficult problem, the existence of evil and suffering in a world claimed to be the creation of a God who is said to be both almighty and loving. I do not need to expatiate on this perplexity, which I think you all understand what I'm talking about. I think it's a problem that holds more people back from religious belief than any other difficulty, and which troubles those of us who are religious believers more than any other difficulty. While I do not claim that all the anguish and indeed anger that we feel at the presence of cancer in the world is removed by the insight of an evolving creation, the issue of suffering is far too deep for such calm intellectualization to be sufficient. Yet at least it does indicate that the presence of cancer is not simply gratuitous, something that a God who is a bit more competent or a bit less callous could easily have removed. It is part of the necessary cost of creation in which creatures make themselves, the shadow side of evolutionary process. Darwin's great discovery, instead of being the final parting of the ways between science and religion, in the manner that is often suggested, I believe was in fact an example of fruitful exchange between the two. Now, what could theology possibly offer to science by way of return for that gift? Certainly not to answer science's questions for it. The irony of the position of those creationists, so-called, who think that Genesis is a divinely written, literal account, kindly provided to save us the trouble of actually having to do science, the irony of that is not only are they wrong about cosmic history, and this is the even sadder part in a way, they also abuse the very scripture they wish to respect. But Genesis 1 is not offered to us as a blow-by-blow account of a hectic and remarkable 6 days. It is offered to us as theological writing, and the insight that it conveys is theological. Its main purpose is to affirm the theological truth that nothing exists except through the sustaining will of God. And God said, "Let there be," is reiterated 8 times in the chapter. And that chapter does not tell us how things began, but it tells us why anything exists. And that's an important general point. Creation is not concerned with the question of beginnings, who lit the blue touch paper at the Big Bang, but with Leibniz's great questions, why is there something rather than nothing? For God is as much creator today as God was 13.7 billion years ago. What theology can offer to science is to take the latter's insights and experience and set them within a wider and deeper context of understanding. Theology does not answer scientific questions, but it does address meta-questions that arise from doing science, questions that are meaningful and necessary to ask, but which take us beyond, that's what meta means, take us beyond science's own self-limited domain of inquiry. And 2 such meta-questions are particularly relevant to the exchange between science and religion. The first question is so simple that we seldom stop even to think about it, but I think it's worth thinking about, and it's simply this: why is science possible at all? Why can we understand the physical world in the profound way that science has shown us? You recall that Einstein once said that the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible. Science cannot offer an explanation of its own great success. It's simply content that that is the way it is, and it just goes ahead with exploiting the wonderful opportunities that this affords. Now, of course, evolutionary survival necessity explains why our minds have been so shaped as to give us rough and ready understanding of everyday processes. But our human scientific powers greatly exceed anything that is needed for that rather banal purpose, or anything that, in my opinion, could be considered a happy accidental spin-off from such mundane necessity. The power of scientific understanding is very, very remarkable indeed. We can understand the strange world of quantum theory and the vast domains of cosmic curved space-time, regimes that are remote from direct impact on our daily lives, and whose understanding calls for highly counterintuitive modes of thought. And of course, the mystery is even deeper than that, where it turns out that the key to unlock the deep secrets of the physical universe is that seemingly most abstract of subjects, mathematics. It is an actual technique of discovery in fundamental physics to seek theories whose mathematical expression is in terms of beautiful equations. A quest that is not an act of aesthetic indulgence, but a recourse to a strategy which time and again in the history of physics has proved its long-term fruitfulness. One of my great scientific hero, who is Paul Dirac, once said that it is more important to have mathematical beauty in one's equations than to have them fit experiment. So there. Of course, he did not mean that empirical adequacy was a dispensable quality for a scientist. Nobody could be so foolish as to say that. But you see, if your equations at first sight did not seem to fit experiment, maybe you had solved the equations in an incorrect approximation. Or maybe the experiments were wrong. We have known that happen more than once in physics. Anyway, there was at least some residual hope that all might, after all, be well. But if your equations were ugly, the situation was hopeless. The whole record of history was against you. The testimony of 3 centuries of scientific experience showed that you were on the wrong track. Dirac made his own great discoveries through a lifelong and highly successful quest for beautiful equations. He once said it was a very profitable religion to possess. He said that ironically, I think, but he may have spoken truer than he knew. Dirac's brother-in-law, Eugene Wigner, himself, of course, a Nobel laureate for physics, famously asked, why is mathematics so unreasonably effective? Why is this abstract discipline the gateway to physical discovery? Why does the reason of our minds, our mathematical reasoning within, have this amazing correspondence to the reason without, the rational structure of the world in which we live? We have found the universe is not only rationally transparent and open to our inquiry, but also that it is rationally beautiful, and hence that basic experience, scientific experience of wonder that we noted earlier. Now it seems to me it would be intolerably intellectually lazy just to say, gee, that's the way it is, and better good luck for you chaps who are good at maths. Meta questions like this are too deep for indisputable answer, but for me the most intellectually satisfying and coherent explanation of why science is possible and mathematics is so unreasonably effective is in fact that the universe is a creation whose marvelous order has originated in the mind of its creator, and, to use an ancient and powerful phrase, we are creatures made in the image of our creator. The reason within and the reason without fit together because they have that common origin in God, who is the creator, both of our mental life and of the physical world of which we are parts. For me, religious belief makes science's discovery of cosmic intelligibility itself an intelligible aspect of reality. A second meta question that we must consider is somewhat more specific in its character. And it asks, why is the universe so special? I am, of course, referring to the collection of insights usually gathered together under the rubric of the anthropic principle. As scientists came to understand many of the processes that have turned that initial simple ball of energy into the richly structured and diversified world we see today, they came to recognize time and again that the possibility of such evolving fruitfulness depended critically on the laws of nature taking specific forms, and that the constants of nature, specifying the intrinsic strength of the forces operating, had to lie within narrowly defined limits. Whether it was the hectic transmutations taking place in the first 3 minutes following the Big Bang, or the formation of the heavy elements in the nuclear furnaces of the stars, or the delicate properties of matter that allowed the formation of replicating molecules as the basis of life, whatever process, thinking about a kind of fine-tuning of fundamental physics was necessary to permit the possibility of these fertile processes. If nuclear physics wasn't the way it is, there would be no carbon made inside stars, and there would be no carbon-based life anywhere in the world. The explorations of evolutionary chance would have been of no avail if given necessity had not taken a form closely similar to that of our world. A universe that is capable of producing carbon-based life is a very special universe indeed. And with this audience here tonight and in this place, I do not need to elaborate on the many detailed and beautiful considerations that have led to this conclusion, which is probably just as well as a half-adequate discussion would take quite a while. Now, this discovery of anthropic specificity came as a considerable shock to many scientists. Our natural instinct professionally is to prefer the general to the particular, and I share in that instinct. So the natural expectation was that the universe would turn out to be nothing out of the ordinary, just a common or garden kind of cosmos, as you might say. However, it's now clear that this is by no means the case, and on that all agree. The disagreements come when one considers what to make of this remarkable fact. And there have been three basic kinds of response to the recognition of anthropic specificity. The first response simply notes that if the universe had not been hospitable to the possibility of carbon-based life, then, of course, we would not be here to think about it. That's obviously true. Yet fine-tuning is so remarkable that it seems to me, at least, to be a supine response, just to say, we're here because we're here, and that's that. To borrow a philosophical parable from John Leslie, whose book Universe is, I think, one of the best books about the anthropic principle, to borrow the parable, if a prisoner survives after 50 highly trained marksmen have failed to execute him, of course, had he not survived, he would not be in a position to wonder why. But given his truly remarkable escape from death, it is only rational for him to consider whether there was more going on in that event than he had realized. Perhaps the marksman had been on his side, and they had missed by design. The second response corresponds to just that option in the story. It appeals to the theistic belief that the universe is indeed not any old world, but it is a creation that has been endowed by its creator with just the finely tuned laws and circumstances that have enabled it to have so fruitful a history. Now, it's very important to distinguish this belief in an intrinsically designed creation in the sense of its given physical fabric from the claims of the so-called intelligent design, capital I, capital D, movement. The latter looks for gaps in unfolding process that, in its view, could only be filled by the direct and specific action of the Creator. Its theological picture of God is that of a divine artificer occasionally intervening. Its explanations are presented in opposition to science's account of continuously unfolding process. Now, the understanding of creation that I espouse, in contrast, looks not to discrete events claimed to be inexplicable, but to the character of the laws of nature, laws that science itself has to treat as its given brute facts, the basis of its explanatory work, but which religion understands to be expressions of the will of the God who ordains and sustains nature and being. And there is no rivalry between this understanding of creation and the account of cosmic process given by science. They complement each other rather than conflicting with each other. The third response arose, I believe, partly as a reaction to what some perceived as the looming threat of theism. It proposes an immensely enhanced kind of naturalism, supposing our universe to be but one member of a truly vast multiverse. If the latter contained enough and sufficiently varied separate universes, it would not be too surprising if in one of them, just by chance, things turned out to be compatible with evolving carbon-based life. Of course, that winning ticket in the grand multi-cosmic lottery is our world, because we are carbon-based life. Now, I think it's important to recognize this proposal what it is. Since all those trillions of other universes are inaccessible to our observation, the suggestion goes far beyond being a scientific proposal, and it is as fully metaphysical a belief, I believe, as belief in the existence of a divine creator. Now, of course, I know that there are highly speculative theories of quantum gravity, such as string theory, which might be held to suggest the spontaneous generation of multitudes of universes. Now, these are very interesting theories. The exploration of relativistic quantum theory is a very sensible thing to do, and very clever people are doing it. But these theories, when they make realistic claims, attempt to second-guess nature more than 16 orders of magnitude beyond anything for which we have had direct empirical contact. And it seems to me that the lessons of history are strongly against such an ambitious project. At the present time, there is an amazing lack of restraint among many working in fundamental physics. The intellectual atmosphere is one that is hospitable to speculation to a quite astonishing degree. When it emerged that string theory did not, after all, lead to a unique account of the structure of the universe, but quite to the contrary, there might be as many as 10 to the 500 different possibilities, there were some who did not hesitate to conclude that these 10 to the 500 possibilities must therefore exist. I do not think that it is merely the inherent conservatism of the elderly that makes me think that this speculative frenzy is an unhealthy state of affairs for physics. But back to the possible significance of anthropic fine-tuning. Which should we choose, creation or multiverse? Leslie suggests, in his careful philosophical evaluation, that it's 50-50. Each explanation will be taken with equal seriousness. And I am inclined to think that he is right as far as fine-tuning goes. But it seems to me that the multiverse only does one piece of explanatory work, explaining or explaining away the specific character of our universe. But belief in a creator God seems to me to do more than simply offering understanding anthropic specificity. I've suggested it also explains the deep intelligibility and rational beauty of the universe. And of course, in addition, it explains that very widely attested human experience of encounter with sacred reality. Therefore, I believe that anthropic arguments can properly be part of a cumulative case for theistic belief, which does not seem to me to have a counterpart on the multiverse side of the question. That's what I think. Anyway, it's time to end, and I'm someone who wants to take with absolute seriousness the insights of both science and religion. I believe that I can do so, not of course without puzzles, since no metaphysical view is that unproblematically straightforward. But I believe with intellectual integrity. I certainly hope so. I like to say that I am two-eyed, looking with both the eye of science and the eye of religion. And I believe that I can see further and more clearly using that binocular vision than I could with either eye on its own. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, John, for a quite inspiring lecture. John's also kindly agreed to take a few questions. We have a little time. I just have to explain the rules, though, carefully. We're on the web, so if you raise your hand, I will try and get a microphone to you. And please don't start to pose your question until the microphone is with you. So, naturally I look this way first, so I'll try and look back next time. There's a gentleman here, Madeline.
Sir John, thank you very much for a very inspiring lecture. I go back to your hypothesis. Science and theology are rational cousins. And epistemologically speaking, you try to justify that. However, in explaining and defining your hypothesis or supporting it, you have used language which is different from science and theology. You juxtapose, for example, testing and trusting. You juxtapose public fact and private opinion. You juxtaposed rationality against belief. How can you really say, in the heart of your heart, that you can really reconcile the two using the same sort of paradigm? You can't.
Well, I'm not exactly using the same sort of paradigm. I'm trying to have a broad rational umbrella. By that I mean the search for motivated belief, the search for understanding through motivated belief. And I believe that science and religion and lots of things in between, lots of forms of human experience, shelter under that umbrella. Now, of course, it is a cousinly relationship, and there are degrees of distance among cousins. And certainly the discourse at one end of the spectrum is different from the discourse at the other. But I think that its fundamental character of a search for understanding and a desire to believe not on the basis of unquestionable authority, but on the basis of motivated belief is a common factor. You have testing at one end, you have testing at the other, but there's a connection between them. So it's a broad, it's a sort of Wittgensteinian family resemblance that expresses the cousinliness of the two.
Right. Can I ask you to just keep your questions as brief as possible? There's a lot of questions I can see here from the front, and we've perhaps got 7 minutes at the most, so let's turn it round quickly. There's a gentleman just here who raised his hand. He'll be the next.
How exactly does theology explain why there is something and not nothing?
Thank you. That's
Well,
nice and brief.
Every metaphysical view has to have an unexplained basis. And in Western thought, there are essentially two options. One is you take the brute fact of matter as not requiring an explanation. So you say there just is something, and that's it. And that's materialism. That's what David Hume would like you to do. Or you take the will of a divine agent as the unexplained starting point. And, of course, then you have the embarrassing child's question, who made God? And the answer is, God is self-existent and does not need to be made. That's a brute fact. So my brute fact is the belief in the existence of God. A materialist would take the brute fact of the physical world. For the reasons I've sketched very hastily this evening, I don't think the laws of nature are sufficiently self-contained not to point beyond themselves to a deeper and broader explanation. That's why I look towards a divine agent. That's a quick answer to an important question.
It's really, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. It's really a question about the evidence for the existence of God. I presume your evidence really comes from the scriptures. But in the last 2,000 years, can you name a single thing that God has actually done?
Well, that's an amusing challenge, Lewis. But yes, I think many things. I mean, I think God is at work in people's lives. God's presence in this world is veiled from our sight. He's not unambiguously present. God doesn't write in the sky, "Here I am. This is what you've got to do." But anyone, I think, who looks at the history of the ups and downs of the history of religious understanding can see God at work, both seeking to deal with the suffering of the world, seeking to make the divine nature more clearly known. I can't give an itemized answer in that sense, and you wouldn't expect me to. That would be an absurd expectation, I think.
Natalie? This gentleman here.
Sorry. Hello, yeah. You said that is the old Bible, one of the Bible precepts. We are created in the image of God. How do you actually explain that theologically in relation to science?
Well, it's been a long matter of dispute in Christian theology about what the image of God might mean. Some people thought it was rationality, and that's rather a Donish view of the image of God. I think it is that we are actually open to knowledge of the presence of God, not in the unambiguous, nailed-down way that Lewis Walpole would like us to itemize. But I think that people do have access to the divine will and divine grace. And that is the fundamental meaning of the image of God. But that carries with it things like rationality and the power of understanding.
Yes. Regarding you seem to agree with the physicists that we seem to have a 50-50 option whether to choose science or God. But if we choose God, where does that leave us as far as what we should do tomorrow? Because every religion that is formal seems to contradict itself. And so even if you choose God, it leaves you absolutely nowhere because you don't have anything else to go on apart from what you had yesterday. And it seems to suggest that people of faith have a monopoly on, say, compassion or caring or whatever, when in fact most of the other people do just as well without the faith.
Well, first of all, I didn't say it was 50-50. I said that as far as the anthropic argument is concerned, it was 50-50. I then went on to explain why I think the balance tilts if you look at wider things. Secondly, I wouldn't for a minute deny that there are people of great ethical integrity and powerful influence who are not religious believers. We don't, by any means, have a monopoly in that sort of area. I don't agree that a religious belief gives you no indication of how to behave. The problems of the word are, of course, very difficult and very complex, and often involve clashes of goods. So there are perplexities in that sort of area for all of us.
Sir, I'm a great fan of your written work. You are an absolutely incisive physicist without any doubt. The one thing I wanted to ask you is this. It's a great pity that we are stuck with the Wittgenstein legacy of living in a schizophrenic universe where we can kind of coexist with religions and science. I think in this century, the worldview or the truth claims of religions as well as science-oriented worldviews need to be reconciled. Are you aware of the great, for example, resonance within, say, the Hindu theology the non-theistic esoteric Hindu theology, and the findings of modern science like quantum mechanics?
Well, let me say one thing about that. I think one of the great problems is to understand how the world faith traditions relate to each other. They are all clearly expressing authentic encounter with the reality of the sacred, but they say such different things about it, and we need to talk to each other. Not just today, but for the third millennium, I think, to sort these things out. I'm certainly not suggesting that religion or science or any other worthwhile human search for understanding is simply a language game in that sense. Simply, that's how we define it. I think the idea of family resemblance is useful, and I used it, but I wasn't buying the whole Wittgensteinian program.
I'm just going to take one more question. There's a very patient gentleman with the white pamphlet in his hand there, Madeline.
Sorry, a recently published testable scientific theory. Can you hear? Okay.
Not terribly well.
No, I'll try again.
I think if you held the microphone, it might help.
Okay. A recently published testable scientific theory of human cognition called semantic category theory indicates that we have 4 different forms of information processing, and that when we interweave any 2 of these forms, we produce ambiguity or paradox, or create mythological and metaphysical concepts such as griffins or gods. I wonder if you've had the opportunity to study semantic category theory and have perhaps found observable evidence that refutes semantic category theory.
Well, the honest answer is I haven't had the chance to study it, as you may possibly have guessed. I mean, I regret that in a way, but I'm also a little bit suspicious of too neat categorization of things. It seems to me that reality alludes to too tight a grid being imposed upon it, but that may not be relevant. But I can't comment further.
So I'm going to draw matters to a close now, and it falls to me to express our collective thanks to John for, as I said before, was a really quite splendid lecture, and I'd like to thank you also for your very lively questions as well. I said at the start that part of our mission was to deal with the big questions, and it seems to me that John has dealt with actually what I would call the very biggest questions, to be quite candid, namely the nature of existence and reality that we've touched on. I particularly enjoyed his insights into what I call the quantum, unrepeatable nature of reality, the issue of the gentleman raised back there, why is there something rather than nothing? And then, given that we exist in something, the problem of suffering in the world. These very nice insights. On a lighter note, though, that sounds a bit heavy, on a lighter note, I was particularly taken with his phrase that reality is surprising. And I couldn't help thinking, yes, if you support the English football team, reality is indeed very surprising. Anyway, I risk to lower the tone at that point, so I shall stop there. It's been a real honour and a privilege, John, to have you come and share your thoughts with us today. Ladies and gentlemen, would you join with me in thanking John for his quite inspiring lecture? Thank you.